Hello, I'm Adolfus, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics. So I'm not really going to make this as a full blown, as some might say, organized type of discussion, but rather I'm simply going to look at the issues sort of in a more uh, open flow kind of way. And that's why I did this as a live stream so that I don't have to fill up my hard drive with hours upon hours of footage, so that I can actually just simply talk from the top of my head and think things through. So ultimately, I have come to the realization that I reject the idea of natural rights and natural law. And you might say that this is a very extreme position to take. However, I took this position after quite a bit of deliberation. Now, I recently have read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which I ended up largely disagreeing with, which I think is very interesting, despite the fact that for so many people it has been very highly convincing. I found it as more discouraging my confidence in the idea of natural law, particularly after I did my critique of the Declaration of Independence. I have really come to the conclusion that natural law is not something that exists, in the sense that there's no such thing, in my view, of a law that is a priori, or that is axiomatic, in the sense that there's no right and wrong in an axiomatic sense, in as in that there's none of that rests upon itself, so that you could say in nature that if I were to say, uh, let's say I were to get really angry with someone and follow the nature of my anger and murder them, that particular action would not be right or wrong in an axiomatic sense. In other words, I've come to the conclusion that morality is fundamentally subjective in a sense. Now, I'm not saying that it's absolutely subjective, but that the idea of objective morals require a different objective basis. And I do not believe that nature, or the natural state, is the the logical foundation for such a basis. As in, let's say people make an argument that in a natural state you would be able to breathe and to speak freely, but I say, what is right, what is good about a natural state? Because if you want to have a natural right, then something has to be right in nature. But if nature itself is not right or justified, then why should anything that is derived from nature be right or justified? So the real question is then, how do we justify nature itself? And at that point, you end up in a position where you can't really say that morality is derived from nature, because making the statement that nature has a moral worth is in itself a moral statement, and therefore you would either have to return in a circle and make it axiomatic that nature is good, or you have to say that nature itself cannot be the foundation for its own moral good and moral goods that are derived from nature, which means that something else is the foundation. So ultimately, I've come to the conclusion that from a pragmatic perspective, it makes sense that authority is indeed the foundation for rights and for good and evil, in a sense that in a natural state, the reason why one would be able to say that breathing is good or that being able to speak freely is good, is not because of nature itself and the natural ability to do such things, but rather because of the person's own authority to do such things. And therefore, the person is exercising his own authority and self control over his own body in taking such actions. And therefore, that is why those actions are justified. However, one might say that in a state, when there is a government, that certain actions, even if they be natural, can be considered wrong. And therefore, by the state considering such actions wrong, the state then enforces its authority upon the people, and then such actions are therefore wrong and evil to the people, because in doing so, they would be disobedient to the state. And you might say, how does the state come as a moral authority? Well, the answer is the state comes as a moral authority due to its power. And by concentrating its power, the state has the capability to punish actions that it considers wrong. And you may say, well, how does the punishment of an action make the action wrong? And ultimately, you have to get to a point where you have to actually define what right and wrong is. And ultimately, the definition that I have come up with is that evil is ultimately linked with a disobedience to authority. Now, you may say, well, Anawiltos, how can you say that there is no absolute morals in this universe if you yourself are a Christian? And yes, I am a Christian. However, this is entirely compatible with the Christian ethic. And you may ask how. And the answer is that you could go up from different levels of government, and then the top level of government would therefore have the highest authority and would be able to have the greatest amount of power and of authority in telling people what they can do and what they cannot do, and in defining good and evil in that way. However, if you were to say that there is an all-powerful being that knows everything and then punishes all evil and allows no evil to go unpunished, therefore all evil being punishable is ultimately addressed. In other words, even if you do something in secret, you can get punished for it. So even opportunistic crime that goes unpunished is, in fact, unjustified because it does get punished eventually. And in the same way as in a particularly Christian ethic, there's a command to be obedient to the government. And I particularly agree with John Jewell's An Homily Against Disobedience and Willful Rebellion, that following that, therefore, the government itself gains a mandate for obedience, not only the government's obedience to the God, but the obedience of the subordinates towards that government, therefore making the government a middle arbiter of good and evil. Now, that being said, that's ultimately why I disagreed with the theological points that were brought up by the writers of the United States Declaration of Independence. However, let's argue for the purpose of being charitable to other groups. What if we take God out of the equation? Well, if we take God out of the equation, then what we have is a situation where the state is the ultimate arbiter of good and evil. And then the question then becomes, is there any particular ethic that is necessary besides the obvious one of obedience? Is there any other ethic that is fundamentally necessary? Well, the answer is no, there isn't. In other words, you could theoretically have a state that allows rape, murder, assault, and things like that. However, ultimately, what I say is that you have to take a partisan position and a preferential position, a prejudicial position, and declare that certain things are particularly wrong to your state, such as rape and murder and such things, in my particular opinion. And you will have to say that those who actively and disagree and take direct action against the particular ethic of the state will have to get punished by the state by means of violence, ultimately, although not necessarily. Ultimately, if the state is not willing to go the final step, then the state will not be able to enforce its authority. So, ultimately speaking, we then come to a situation where all ethics are ultimately preferential, and of course, the Christian ethic is preferential to the character of God, as is conceived by the Christians, and there might be other ethics that have similar values and ethics that have different values, but ultimately you have to come to a point where you define particular ethics as being the correct ethics and particular ethics as being the incorrect ethics. And you have to come to a conclusion that you're going to draw a partisan line at some point that you're not allowing anyone to cross, ultimately creating a system of oppression. But the system of oppression is justified by its own power and authority as being good. So there you go. Ultimately, there there are forms of oppression that are good, and one such form is one that enforces the moral values upon the people, and by nature of it being brought by authority, it is good, and therefore I have to say that might makes right, and I have to agree with King Charles I of of England and Scotland when, well, he wasn't, was he the first of Scotland? I'm not sure. Anyway, King Charles I, he went on trial at the English Civil War. He got captured and he was put on trial, I think, in front of the House of Commons. I read the transcript of the trial and all the things that he had said, and I have to agree with him when he brings up the idea, not in the particular words that I'm saying, but the idea of sovereign immunity, that when there's a sovereign, that sovereign cannot be accused by his subjects without his permission, because the sovereign himself is indeed the arbiter of good and evil over his people. So it would be a severe sense of insubordination to do this. Now, you then may ask, well, are you in favor of monarchy then? Is a question that you may ask me. And I am actually not in favor of monarchy. And I'm not saying that monarchy is categorically evil, because that would be inconsistent with my moral values as a Christian. However, I have to say that in a particular system where we assume that there is no particular preference, in the sense that we don't have, for example, God coming down and anointing a king for us. So we have to say, how are we going to decide who is going to govern a society? Now, of course, I'm not arguing for rebellion against a pre-existing kingship. I'm more of a reform-minded individual, because I consider rebellion itself to be an ultimate act of evil. However, when I think about this, I have to come to the conclusion that ultimately, giving given that there is no particular genetic preference in a society for its leader, we have to create a system of establishing leaders that is consistently going to provide good leaders. And providing good leaders is not always easy and can be very difficult. And one such system is democracy. Now, I'm going to contrast this with let me contrast it with aristocracy and autocracy. So, democracy is a system wherein the people have the power. Aristocracy, where there's an elite that has the power, and autocracy, where there is a single individual that has the power. You could also make different arguments with, for example, monarchy um, it is similar to autocracy in the sense that there's a difference between archy and kratos. There's a difference there, so I do want to point out that it's not the same. Um, and I suppose you could say that there would be such a thing as demarchy. However, demarchy has been used um, in different ways historically, so using the term demarchy might not necessarily be useful. But anyway, I do believe that archy should be in a hierarchy. A little pun there, and the reason I believe that is because, pragmatically speaking, it is more effective to have a hierarchy than to have uh, every single person have the same authority, or to have one authority over every single person equally, as would be in a possibly unitary system or a centralized direct democracy or something like that. I don't agree that that would be particularly effective, particularly because it becomes less efficient the larger it becomes. And the advantage that I argue, the reason why I pick democracy over aristocracy and and autocracy is because democracy gives you a very broad pool to draw talent from. And what's important in getting a good archon is getting someone who has a good talent for being an archon, for being a justiciar, for being a jurist, someone who can judge the people and someone who can bring justice, both in the sense of arbitration or in the case of resistance to arbitration of conquest. So now, of course, I use the term conquest to refer to the idea of using violent force in order to implement one's justice upon someone who is resistant to arbitration, which is the nonviolent implementation of justice. So I'm using that in a qualified sense, using a particular terminology. I wonder if one day people will name that terminology after me, just like they did with Karl Marx. With you've got Marxist terminology, and you've got Aristotelian terminology, Platonian terminology, all sorts of things. But anyway, let's get back to the point. So the advantages of democracy is a wide talent pool uh, to draw from. And another advantage is that because every single person has some degree of political agency, we have a situation where a wide range of issues can be addressed. So there are no particular issues in a democracy that would not necessarily be addressable because every single person has a voice, and therefore all issues can be addressed. And thirdly, you have the idea of accountability, because we are not going to say that we're going to be able to find a perfect leader, and that leader is going to lead society perfectly, because we don't know if there is a perfect leader out there. So what we have to do is we have to create a situation where a leader can exist, and that leader can, in case of mismanagement and corruption, be removed and replaced. And this is what I think is an advantage that democracy has over more monarchical and even aristocratic systems, because in a democracy, you have a very wide range of accountability. However, the problem in democracy that occurs is that if a democracy becomes too large, then the accountability starts decreasing, in the sense that what makes you able to hold individuals accountable is your ability to directly interact with such individuals. So, in a democracy, if you have 1,000 people or 10,000 people uh, voting for a leader, you might be able to say that you can hold the leader relatively accountable, because the leader would theoretically have the time to meet with individuals who wanted to discuss particular issues. Now, let's say you say it's 1 million or 10 million. At that point, we reach a point of inefficiency where if you wanted to speak with a leader, it might be difficult. And let's say you are over a large geographic area. It might be difficult to find a time to speak with a leader. And what this does is that it gives opponents to the leader and individuals in the media the opportunity to make stuff up about the leader that aren't necessarily true. And also, it gives the leader himself the opportunity to make things up, and individuals who might know the leader might be drowned out voice wise over against individuals who do know what the leader is actually doing, and might they might be drowned out by individuals who don't know what the leader is actually doing and who get whipped up by the leader's rhetoric. So ultimately, what you end up with is a problem of populism, where populism, the idea that there's a few different ways to interpret populism. One is doing things that the people want. The other one is changing the people's wants towards things that you are doing. Now, the first one is uh, an important element in democracy. However, there is such a thing as what I would call common nonsense, particularly in relation to the media. That means that the larger a system becomes, the less likely it is for the people to have uh, informed opinions on what exactly is going on. In the sense that in your own town, you might be very well familiar with environmental challenges and economic problems, but you might not be familiar with how that goes with the other end of the country. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to assume that an individual on one end of a country can make an informed decision on policies that affect the entire country, regardless of the particular local issues. So I think democracy works best on a local level. And because on a local level, it's you're the least likely to have individuals who are ignorant on what is happening locally, or individuals that are deceived on what is happening in their neighbors' homes. Because on a local level, you can directly speak to individuals and hold them directly accountable socially, which you can't do on a country that has 100 million people. You can't do that. So having democracy on such a large scale simply doesn't make sense, because it negates the advantages of democracy. And because it negates the advantages of democracy, it therefore has democracy and fails in the very goals of democracy. In other words, such a democracy is unsuitable for large states. So what I say is that what we have historically of an example of such things working more efficiently is hierarchies, where you can have the social and economic policies on the local level where individuals are likely to understand the issues, to be well informed, and be able to hold their leaders accountable well, so that such issues are addressed in a good manner and in a safe manner, a manner that befits the needs of the community. And then you have other issues put on a larger level, such as arbitration between the municipalities, between the communities, such as, let's say, there would have to be some types of arbitration. For example, the common defense is something that is, in my opinion, very important when creating a large state. So you've got the common defense, uh, you've got the idea of the type of credit that is used to pay for the common defense, and therefore the type of credit that is used for taxation. Now I have my own monetarist views on how exactly that should work. I have essentially a system where the central government controls three different types of credit, and where local governments can also have their own credit as well, but that payments relating to the government can only be made in the correct type of credit. But I'm not going to get into that right now. But anyway, going back to the democratic aspect. So then people can elect leaders locally that they know they can trust. And how do they know them? Because they know the leaders personally. They know they can trust them, and they elect them. And then those leaders can send they can send representatives higher up, who then can elect a leader that they trust, and then operate in a parliamentary way. The locals government doesn't have to operate parliamentary because not everybody likes parliamentary systems. And you know what? There might be some radical and extreme systems, but I would say that extreme systems would be safe, legal, and rare. Because number one, the government would have a a central ethic that punishes individuals for violating the rights of individuals in and the rights of communities in a very direct sense, therefore making it safe. Legal in a sense that acknowledging that different communities have different interests, and the idea that experimentation when it concerns social and economic policy can in fact be beneficial. You have the legal aspect, and rare in the sense that ineffective systems, such as many of these radical and extremist systems, uh, do end up being less prosperous, and therefore will not be able to survive in its tax efficiency, and also due to capital flight and people leaving for better societies as the society fails. Therefore, it becomes rare, and the successful establishment of such societies, such as a society that has social and economically fascist policies, or social and economically communist policies, social and economically syndicalist policies, would not be very common. There might be a few here and there. There might even be some that last a long time. But if we do have confidence that such systems are indeed not the most efficient or effective systems, then it would be safe to assume that they would be rare. And if we also allow people to vote to change the systems as is the needs of community accommodates, and also to leave when such systems become ineffective, then we will prevent the promulgation of ineffective systems. And therefore, the municipalities end up having what I believe through means of macro liberalism, that is the liberty of these communities to determine their own social and economic system, they end up creating what I like to call macro capitalism, where there's a flow of human capital that occurs, and human capital means work and labor force, which can translate into prosperity, and these communities have to compete to attract individuals that will allow them to prosper well. And to do that, they will have to have attractive policies and effective policies. And at the same time, I would also say that the communities should be allowed to bar individuals that they believe would not be helpful for the growth of their community from entering and residing in their community. I'm not saying that travelers wouldn't be allowed to travel through. No, because for obvious reasons, for purposes of justice, there would need to be the ability of individuals to travel from different parts of a country. Now, I also believe in a separation, therefore, of the municipality and the state in the sense that the municipality itself is considered a corporate entity that is not the same as the state, but that is taxed in essence, and that the state is therefore the entity that is comprised of the structure that organizes all these municipalities into infra-orders, where you have different levels where they parliamentarily vote for higher levels, which allows the state to expand laterally and vertically as is needed. Because I believe that any state that cannot expand infinitely in relation to its territory or population is ultimately flawed. And I believe in creating a state that has the least flaws possible. And so, going back to the point that I was trying to make that I have now forgotten, we have a situation where, let's see, I talked about the macro capitalism and how these groups can select their own leadership and that they can bar each other from entering. Okay, the point I was getting to is that by separating the state from municipality, it means that the state itself cannot be within municipalities. So what you end up is you avoid the formation of city-states, essentially. For example, I would say that France nowadays, Paris is so important in France that France essentially orbits around Paris. France is the city-state of Paris, with Paris being the city and the rest of France being the periphery to that city. Essentially, in a sort of lower state, similar to how the Roman Empire operated, where you have Rome, and then there are many colonies of Rome and associated cities which are orbiting Rome. And in order to get anywhere in Roman politics, you would have to either be in the military or get involved in the politics of the city of Rome itself, at least in the Republic. Because Rome as a state originated as a city-state and continued growing as a city-state, even though it began absorbing more cities, which is very interesting to analyze the political structure of how all these cities were organized. However, I'm not really talking about that right now. What I'm saying is that the regional governments and the intermediate levels of government and ultimately the top level of government, the sovereign government, would have to exist in places that are outside of the municipalities. In other words, they would have government complexes that are not part of any city, or they may be near urban regions, but they are categorically defined as not part of a city. And therefore, anyone that is a permanent resident of such things, which the politicians wouldn't be. They'd all be particular citizens of a particular municipality. Um, Anyone that would live there permanently would not have the right to vote. And you might say, why not? Why have this situation? Because it encourages individuals to be part of the municipalities, to either form a community or join a community. Now, what would happen is individuals that would be leaving communities for a reason and wouldn't be able to join other communities would be allowed to enter into the municipal area and would live there. And of course, they would be administered by whichever particular level of government is operating there, in the sense that they would still have to be taxed in order to incentivize them to leave. They would also have to be punished more harshly for crimes, also to incentivize them to leave. And in the case of, I would say that they would also, that level of government would also reserve the right to gather up the people that are living there and to form a colony in some place that can then become a new municipality. And I think that that would be useful. And you might say, why are you being so harsh on these people? Well, the answer is because I want to avoid a situation where a city where the government resides becomes particularly important. Because what happens then is that you end up ruining the divide between the economy and social policy and the state by doing this. Now, I'm certain that there would be cities that would be more open to allowing people to join, and that therefore the problem of uncitied citizens would never, in my opinion, be a major issue, because there would likely be always some place that's looking for labor, and they would always look to be inviting towards individuals, and of course that would work well. But anyway, tell me what you think. Do you think that what I'm saying makes sense? Do you think it's not making sense? Do you think I'm some sort of horrible individual for opposing ideas of natural law? Getting back onto the idea of natural law, let's go back to that, because naturally speaking, I think that there's no is okay. Well, let me be very clear here. You can't really define an is as being an ought in a natural sense, unless it is directly affecting you, as I would say in a religious sense. However, ultimately, I have to say that it is all partisan, because in order for something to, what happens in a partisan sense is that the government enforces its laws. It makes laws and enforces them. And therefore, that's a pragmatic sense, that if you are going to get punished for rape, that the government is going to be punishing you. And that then becomes the ought, that you ought not rape because the government is going to punish you. And then that becomes the is again, because the government has outlawed rape and the government is going to punish you. Rape is wrong, because and therefore it becomes objective again, based on the pragmatic principle that ultimately the government is the ultimate authority. Now, of course, from a religious perspective, there's a higher authority. However, I'm not really talking about that right now, because in a theological sense, I say that although some might say that these ethics that God has are inherent to the universe, I think that from a Christian perspective, that would be heresy, because it would be saying that God himself is a part of a universe that he created in a more direct conceptual sense. Now, I know that there are conceptions in Hinduism that believe this, but I'm not a Hindu, so I'm not really accountable to such a belief. So ultimately, I have to say that there is a separation in a Christian ethic between God and his creation. And the idea that free will is, of course, in opposition to God. Now, that then you can get into Calvinist arguments, but that's not really what I'm talking about today. So I think I'm going to stop for now, uh, because I really wanted to get a video out today. So that's why I did this. But thank you all for watching. I know that there's at least one person out there that's watching right now. Please do tell me after I'm done in the comment section what you think. If you end up wanting to contact me, not just the person watching, just anyone, please do contact me, and I would be happy to discuss this. This is just a sort of off the cuff talking. I know that I go around in very weird directions sometimes. My train of thought might not be easy for some individuals to follow, because I go left, right, and center everywhere, because I've got a lot of stuff happening in my mind, and then I'm trying to express them at the same time. I've got new thoughts coming out. So it's really really a lot of things happening in my mind, and it's not always easy to express all of them coherently at the same time. So tell me what you think. Do you want me to make a more formal video where I discuss things in a way that is perhaps a bit more structured? I might be able to do that, and that would, I suppose, that would help solve the problems that people have in misunderstanding me. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Awultus. Over and out.